Hello, everyone. This video is designed to hopefully help answer any questions you might have about where you're going to get your IB score from for the DP chemistry course. So obviously there's both SL and HL DP chemistry. And so I've broken down here from the IB syllabus the differences between those two courses in terms of the material. Unlike in some of the other sciences where the SL and HL classes actually covered completely different topics, in chemistry, SL and HL will cover the same topics, but the HL will cover those topics in more depth. So you can see how the syllabus is structured. For SL, there's topics 1 through 11, essentially chapters 1 through 11. And then in the HL, there's additional chapters or topics 12 through 21. But the setup is basically that for SL, the topic number 2, for example, is called atomic structure. The HL portion of atomic structure is topic 12. So take the SL topic and add 10 to it, and you get what is referred to as the HL topic. So that's really just the HL material. So there aren't 10 extra chapters in HL. There's just sort of 10 extensions on the SL material, but it's the same focus. So atomic structure SL, and then HL atomic structure, chemical bonding SL, chemical bonding HL. Also listed here, what I've boxed off in red, these are the recommended teaching hours that's proposed by the IB. It doesn't mean we'll spend exactly this number of hours on these subjects, but it does give you a sense of sort of their importance when it comes down to the IB exam. So, for example, something like atomic structure, 6 hours in SL and 2 hours in HL, that's about 8 hours total. If you compare that to something like chemical bonding, 13.5 and 7, so 20.5 hours total if you're doing HL, or organic, 11 plus 12, 23 hours total. You can tell certain topics are going to be, you're going to be asked about them more on the IB exam than others because of the weighting of time that they've proposed. So essentially, the more time that's dedicated to it on this list, probably the more important that topic is in terms of the amount of questions you're going to see on the actual IB exam. In addition to the core syllabus that we were just talking about, there's also something called an option. And it's an option in the sense that as a class, or at least as a teacher, we will choose one of these to cover. So it's not optional in that we can't just ignore it. Every chemistry student, DP chemistry student, must do one of these options. And I've had students do biochemistry and energy in the past, and also medicinal chemistry. So in time, we will decide which of these to cover. I forget what I was going to say. Well, in time, we're going to decide which one of these to cover. What I was going to say is that it's what we will cover last because it pulls on a lot of core information and a lot of core skills and concepts. So it's hard to do the option before the end of the course. So it's probably the last thing we'll do. And these are the hour allocations here. So you can see that a lot of time is dedicated to the options. So it's quite an important chapter that we cover. In addition, the other hours that we will use in this course is the practical scheme of work, which is really what we're talking about when we're doing lab work. So there's going to be practical activities like demos and just sort of everyday experiments, which are preparatory and mandatory experiments. We've also got time dedicated to what's called the internal assessment or the individual investigation, and also a fun project that will take place at the end of grade 11 that's called the Group 4 project. So IB scoring is on a scale of 1 to 7. What score you eventually get is determined by how many points you earn out of 100 and which sort of grade boundary you fall into. So roughly speaking, overall, to get a 7 in DP chemistry usually is somewhere around the mid to high 70s to 100 out of 100. And then there's a sliding scale down from that. That does change a little bit each year, and those are not the exact grade boundaries that will be used in class, and I'll get into that more in class or in a subsequent video. But right now, we're just talking about your actual IB score that you'll get in 2 years' time. And so that is determined by two different things. The internal assessment, which is worth 20% of the score, and that's a lab report for your individual investigation. And also your external assessment, which is your IB exam, which is covered on 3 different examination papers, what we call paper 1, 2, and 3. And you can see the breakdown here. They're a little different between SL and HL, but more or less, IA is 20%, paper 1 is 20%, and paper 2 is worth almost twice as much, 40 or 36%, and paper 3 is about 20% also. The internal assessment itself is graded on 5 different criteria: personal engagement, exploration, analysis, evaluation, and communication. You're going to hear us call it the IA mostly. Sometimes we'll call it the individual investigation. It's basically a lab report. It's about 6 to 12 pages in length, and you get a score out of 24 that eventually gets converted into a score out of 20, which gets put towards determining your overall IB score. If you've ever written a lab report before, then you'll be pretty familiar with the format. It's just maybe a bit longer than what you've done in the past. It involves planning and designing an investigation. You can design an experiment to carry out in the lab, or you can use simulations and databases to collect data that way. Once you've collected the data, you have to process it and analyze it, and eventually state a conclusion, compare it to previous work, evaluate your method, things like that. You also get assessed on whether or not you've shown evidence of any sort of personal initiative in designing the experiment, and in how you communicate when writing. And so the practical work that we do throughout grade 11 is really to help familiarize you with equipment that's in the lab. It's to help you become more confident in your lab skills. It's to maybe pique interest in certain topics for the course, and it's also to familiarize you with the assessment criteria that eventually will be used to grade your IA. By the end of grade 11 or at the start of grade 12, we'll be proposing IA ideas, and I'll help you through that process. And it won't be until the fall of grade 12 that we actually carry out the IA data collection and actually submit drafts and then final drafts of the IA lab report. But that will be done sometime, usually in the fall of grade 12, but definitely in the first semester of the grade 12 year. So this IA, this 20% of your grade, won't happen until grade 12, but everything that we do during grade 11 is sort of preparatory, and will help you towards a good score in the end. What actually happens is I give you scores. Your teacher will give you scores on your internal assessment lab report, and then at the end, when I submit those scores to the IB, I will have to send in a random sample of your lab reports so that the IB can check up on my grading and make sure that what I'm awarding for marks is consistent with what they think I should be awarding. And so sometimes the marks can actually change slightly from what I give you, but generally it's not a major concern. There aren't any major changes here. And then finally, the IB exam. This will take place in May of your grade 12 year. It actually is, the exam takes place over 2 days and involves 3 different papers. Paper 1 is a multiple choice paper that covers those core topics. So topics 1 through 11 for SL or 1 to 21 for HL. It's 30 or 40 questions depending on the SL or HL exam. Paper 2 is right after paper 1. You get a short break and then you start paper 2. Paper 2 is all short answer and calculation questions. Paper 2 is 50 marks for SL and 95 marks for HL. So you can see that the paper length is significantly longer, especially in paper 2 when we're talking about the higher level course. But both of these papers focus on that core material. Other things to keep in mind: paper 1 is no calculator and no data booklet. So you have to be pretty good with mental math skills. Whereas in paper 2, you are allowed a calculator and you'll have to use a data booklet to look up values and to look up equations to use in that paper. Then you get a break, and the next morning, usually you come back and you complete paper 3. Paper 3 is sort of similar in format to paper 2. It's short answer and calculation questions, no multiple choice questions. Paper 3 actually has 2 parts, the first of which is the same for every student, SL or HL, and it's going to ask you questions about required practical work that you should have done at some point throughout the 2 years of the course. It's also going to give you some data analysis questions where it might present you with some data that you aren't familiar with, and you'll be asked questions about that data. Then part B of paper 3 has to do with the option topic that you covered. So if you did biochemistry, you would answer the questions on biochemistry and you would not answer any of the other questions in that paper booklet. Or if you covered energy, then you would answer the energy questions here. You can see the overall paper 3 is worth 35 marks for SL, and it's worth 45 marks for HL. And you should note that although it's focused on questions about lab work or the option, some core questions might pop up on paper 3. So all the stuff that you were asked about in paper 1 and 2, you might get a couple of little questions that sort of tie in on that paper 3. And then the scores out of 30, 50, and 35 for SL, and out of 40, 95, and 45 are scaled to those percentages that I talked about previously. So even though paper 1 is out of 30 marks, eventually that gets converted to a score out of 20 to go towards this overall IB score here, giving you a score of 1 out of 7. So it's a really fast-paced video. I hope it has given you a slightly better sense about how you're going to get your IB score eventually. And if you have any questions, you can feel free to ask me in class.